The salty breeze carried the promise of an approaching storm as I stood at the harbor, watching the ferry rock gently against the dock. This wasn't how I'd planned to spend my weekend getaway to the coast, but something about the darkening skies and the churning waves called to me. I'm Alex, by the way, a college student desperate for a break from the suffocating concrete jungle of university life. The seaside town of Harborview had seemed like the perfect escape, even if the weather forecast had warned of an incoming squall. Little did I know that this ferry ride would change everything. The massive vessel loomed before me, its white hull streaked with the telltale signs of countless journeys across these waters. The seafarer, as it was called, had been making this crossing for decades, connecting the mainland to the small island community just visible on the horizon when the weather was clear. Today, however, that island was shrouded in mist and dark clouds, making it seem more like a mythical destination than a real place where people lived and worked. As I joined the queue of passengers waiting to board, I couldn't help but notice him, a young man about my age, maybe a few years older, with tousled hair that seemed perpetually windswept. He carried an artist's portfolio case slung over his shoulder, and his fingers were stained with what looked like paint or charcoal. There was something captivating about the way he gazed out at the sea, as though he could read stories in the waves that remained invisible to everyone else. The boarding process began, and we shuffled forward, a mismatched group of locals and tourists, all bound for the island despite the threatening weather. The ferry workers secured ropes and directed traffic with practiced efficiency, their yellow raincoats bright spots of color against the increasingly gray backdrop. I found myself just a few people behind the artist in the boarding line, close enough to notice the small seahorse tattoo peeking out from beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Last ferry of the day, folks," announced a crew member, her voice carrying over the wind. "We're expecting some rough weather, but the captain assures me we'll make it across before the worst hits. Please proceed to the main cabin or the covered deck areas once aboard." The metal gangway clanged beneath our feet as we made our way onto the ferry. Inside, the main cabin smelled of salt, coffee, and the faint mustiness that seems to permeate all seafaring vessels. Passengers dispersed quickly, claiming seats by windows or near the small cafe that served hot drinks and prepackaged sandwiches. I hesitated, unsure where to settle for the 40-minute journey ahead. That's when our eyes met. The artist had paused at the cafe counter, a steaming cup in hand, and caught me staring. Instead of looking away, he smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes and seemed to invite conversation. Without overthinking it, I approached the counter and ordered a coffee of my own. "First time to the island?" he asked as I waited for my drink. "Is it that obvious?" I laughed, feeling a slight flush rise to my cheeks. "You have that look. Part excitement, part did I make a terrible mistake boarding this ferry in this weather?" He extended his free hand. "I'm Jamie, by the way, island resident, perpetual ferry passenger, and occasionally decent artist." "Alex," I replied, shaking his hand and noticing the pleasant roughness of his palm against mine. "College student, city escapee, and definitely questioning my decision-making skills right now." Jamie laughed, and the sound seemed to cut through the background noise of the ferry, the rumble of engines, the chatter of passengers, the occasional announcement over the PA system. "Well, Alex the city escapee, would you like a native guide to point out the sights? Though I should warn you, in about 20 minutes, the only sight might be a wall of rain." I accepted his offer, and we found seats near a window where Jamie began pointing out landmarks on the receding mainland. There was something immediately comfortable about his presence, as though we'd known each other for years rather than minutes. He spoke about the island with such passion, the hidden coves, the artist community he was part of, the way the light changed throughout the day, perfect for capturing in his paintings. "So what brings you to our little island during storm season?" Jamie asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Most tourists prefer the sunshine months." "Spontaneity? Poor planning? A desperate need to get away from campus life?" I shrugged. "Take your pick. I just needed somewhere different, somewhere I could breathe for a weekend." Jamie nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "The island's good for breathing. Something about the air there, it's cleaner, somehow. Makes you feel like you're the first person to ever fill your lungs." Our conversation flowed easily as the ferry pushed further from the mainland. I learned that Jamie had grown up on the island, left for art school in the city, and returned 3 years ago when he realized that his inspiration had always been rooted in the seascapes and community of his home. He now made a living selling his artwork to tourists in summer and teaching art classes at the local community center year-round. In turn, I told him about my studies in environmental science, my cramped apartment shared with 2 other students, and my growing uncertainty about the career path I'd chosen. There was something liberating about confiding in a stranger, or someone who had been a stranger just 30 minutes ago, but now felt like a friend. The ferry lurched suddenly, and the lights flickered. Outside, the sky had darkened considerably, and rain began to lash against the windows. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some stronger winds than anticipated. Please remain seated and secure any loose belongings. We expect some turbulence as we make our crossing, but there's no cause for concern." Despite the captain's reassurances, a murmur of anxiety spread through the cabin. Jamie, however, seemed unfazed. "This old girl has weathered worse," he said, patting the wall of the ferry affectionately. "I've been on this crossing during storms that made this look like a light shower." His confidence was comforting, but as the minutes passed, the ferry's movements became increasingly erratic. Waves slapped against the hull with growing force, and the vessel pitched and rolled in response. A few passengers looked distinctly green, and one child began to cry, quickly hushed by an apologetic parent. Then it happened, a blinding flash of light, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ferry. The lights went out completely, plunging the cabin into a dim twilight broken only by the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Gasps and a few screams punctuated the darkness before emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie blue glow throughout the cabin. The captain's voice returned, noticeably tenser now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a power failure due to a lightning strike. Our emergency systems are functioning, and our engineers are working to restore main power. Please remain calm and in your seats." But calm was in short supply. People rose from their seats, voices raised in concern or outright fear. Crew members moved through the cabin, offering reassurances that seemed to do little to quell the growing panic. The ferry lurched again, more violently this time, sending an unattended coffee cup sliding across a table and onto the floor with a splash and clatter. Jamie leaned closer to me, his voice low but steady. "It's going to get chaotic in here. There's a lower deck, crew quarters and storage mostly, but there's a passenger lounge down there too. It'll be quieter, and the motion isn't as bad closer to the waterline. Want to head down?" I hesitated only briefly before nodding. The idea of escaping the rising tension in the main cabin was appealing, and I found myself trusting Jamie implicitly, despite having met him less than an hour ago. He gathered his portfolio case and my backpack, and we made our way carefully through the dim cabin toward a door marked lower deck. "Authorized personnel and emergency use only. Are we allowed down there?" I whispered as Jamie pushed the door open. He flashed that disarming smile again. "I know most of the crew. They won't mind, especially not today. They have bigger concerns than 2 passengers seeking a little peace and quiet." The stairwell was narrow and steep, illuminated by the same emergency lighting as the main cabin. The ferry's movements felt different here, less jarring but somehow more pronounced, a rolling motion that required a firm grip on the handrail. At the bottom, a short corridor led to several doors. Jamie guided me to one marked Passenger Lounge and pushed it open. The space beyond was small but surprisingly cozy. A room perhaps 15 feet square with bench seating along 2 walls, a few small tables bolted to the floor, and porthole windows that now showed nothing but the dark, churning water outside. The emergency lighting was dimmer here, creating pools of shadow in the corners of the room. "Not exactly luxury accommodations," Jamie said as he set our bags down, "but it beats the panic upstairs." He was right. Even through the floor and walls, we could hear the muffled sounds of commotion from the main deck. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the occasional announcement that we could no longer make out clearly. Down here, though, there was a strange sense of removal from it all, as though we'd stepped into a bubble separate from the chaos above. "So," I said, settling onto one of the benches, "do power outages happen often on this crossing?" Jamie sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. First time I've experienced one, actually. But the Ferry's old, been making this crossing since before either of us was born. She has her quirks. Another roll of thunder sounded, more distant now, but still powerful enough to be felt through the hull of the ship. The Ferry pitched sharply, and I found myself sliding along the bench toward Jamie. Our shoulders collided, and I started to apologize, but he just laughed. "No need for personal space during a storm at sea," he said, making no move to create distance between us. "Maritime tradition, share warmth, share stories, get through it together." I smiled, surprisingly comfortable with our proximity. "Is that an actual tradition, or did you just make that up?" "Bit of both," Jamie admitted with a grin. "But sailors have been huddling together for warmth and comfort during storms since the first humans put boats on water. There's something primal about seeking connection when the elements remind us how small we really are." As if to emphasize his point, the Ferry lurched again, and the emergency lights flickered ominously. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed Jamie's hand. He squeezed back reassuringly, his palm warm against my cold fingers. "Sorry," I said, embarrassed by my instinctive reaction, but not pulling away. "Don't be," Jamie replied softly. "I'm not exactly calm myself. I just hide it better." The admission of vulnerability made me like him even more. There was an honesty about Jamie that I found refreshing. No pretense, no macho posturing, just authentic human emotion. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, hands still joined, listening to the storm rage outside and the distant sounds of the crew working to restore power. "You know," Jamie said eventually, "there's an island legend about storms like this. The old fishermen say that the sea goddess tests new visitors with wind and rain. If you weather her storm without fear, she welcomes you to her shores with good fortune. And if you show fear," I asked, acutely aware that I was still clutching his hand. "Then you're still welcomed," Jamie said with a small smile. "But you have to return again and again until you pass her test. It's her way of making sure you really want to be there." "Sounds like I'm destined to become a regular visitor then." I laughed, trying to mask my nervousness with humor. Jamie turned to face me more directly, his expression suddenly serious in the dim blue light. "Would that be so bad? Coming back, I mean." There was something in his voice, a note of genuine inquiry that went beyond casual conversation. I felt a flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with the pitching of the Ferry. "No," I said softly. "I don't think it would be bad at all." Another violent wave hit the Ferry, sending it lurching to one side. This time, both emergency lights went out completely, plunging us into near-total darkness. I gasped, instinctively tightening my grip on Jamie's hand. "It's okay." His voice came through the darkness, steady and close. "Just the backup generators struggling. They'll kick in again." But as seconds stretched into a minute with no return of light, I felt a shiver of genuine fear run through me. The darkness was absolute except for the faintest glow from the corridor outside, barely visible around the edges of the door. The storm seemed louder now, the creaking of the Ferry's hull more pronounced, the slap of waves against the sides more threatening. "Jamie," I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. "I'm right here," he replied, and I felt his arm slide around my shoulders. "Come here." Without hesitation, I moved closer, allowing him to wrap both arms around me. We shifted on the bench until we were properly embracing, my head against his chest, his chin resting on top of my head. I could hear his heartbeat, slightly elevated but steady, a reassuring rhythm against the chaos of the storm. "Better?" he asked, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath my ear. "Much," I admitted, no longer concerned about appearing brave. There was something profoundly comforting about being held like this, something I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. We stayed that way as minutes ticked by, wrapped together in the darkness as the Ferry continued its labored journey through the storm. Gradually, I felt my fear subsiding, replaced by a different kind of tension, an awareness of every point of contact between our bodies, the scent of salt, and something distinctly Jamie, the gentle rise and fall of his chest with each breath. "Can I tell you something?" Jamie asked, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the storm. "Anything," I replied, making no move to pull away from his embrace. "I noticed you before today. Last summer, you came to the island with friends. You visited the gallery where I sell my work, but you didn't see me. I was in the back room, and I watched you looking at my paintings. You spent almost 20 minutes in front of one particular seascape, a sunset view from the North Cliffs. I've never seen anyone connect with that painting the way you did. I pulled back slightly, trying to see his face in the darkness. That was you? That painting was incredible. I couldn't afford it as a student, but I took a photo of it. It's been my phone background ever since. I felt rather than saw Jamie's smile. I knew I recognized you when you got in line for the ferry today. I almost didn't approach you, was afraid you'd think I was some creepy stalker artist. Instead, you're just a regular artist who remembers random tourists from months ago, I teased, settling back against his chest. Not random, Jamie said quietly. Not to me. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, full of possibility. My heart raced as I considered how to respond. Before I could form the words, a sudden jolt ran through the ferry, and the emergency lights flickered back to life, casting that ethereal blue glow over us once more. We didn't immediately separate. Instead, in the newly restored light, we looked at each other properly for the first time since entering the darkness. Jamie's eyes were intense, questioning, hopeful. I knew mine must mirror the same emotions. I should probably tell you, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, that I'm gay. In case that changes things. Jamie's laugh was soft and warm. Alex, I'm currently holding you in my arms in the dark belly of a ferry during a storm. I'm an artist who remembered you from a brief gallery visit months ago. I specifically invited you down here to be alone with me. I think it's safe to say that your being gay doesn't change things in the way you're worried about. Relief and something like joy bubbled up inside me. So you're also gay? Yes, Jamie confirmed with a smile. And very glad that you are too. The ferry lurched again, but this time neither of us tensed or grabbed for support. We were already holding on to each other, and somehow that felt like the most secure place on the entire vessel. You know, Jamie said, his voice taking on a playful tone, there's another island tradition about storms at sea. Let me guess, another one you're about to make up? I teased. Only partially, he replied with a grin. They say that confessions made during a storm at sea are blessed by the goddess. They carry special weight, special truth. And what would you like to confess, Jamie the island artist? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached up to brush a strand of hair from my forehead, his touch gentle. That I've thought about you more than I should admit since that day in the gallery. That seeing you again today felt like something the universe arranged specially. That holding you right now, even in these ridiculous circumstances, feels more right than anything has in a very long time. My breath caught in my throat. That's quite a confession. Your turn, Jamie said softly. I took a deep breath. I confess that I've never felt an immediate connection with someone the way I did with you today. That I'm terrified of this storm, but somehow not at all afraid of whatever is happening between us. That I came to this island looking for a break from reality, but I think I might have found something much more important instead. Jamie's hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb tracing gently along my jawline. May I? He whispered, his intention clear. In answer, I closed the small distance between us, pressing my lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered in the same moment. Then, as the ferry rolled with another wave, the kiss deepened, becoming something more certain, more hungry. Jamie's arms tightened around me, and I slid my hands up to the nape of his neck, fingers tangling in his hair. We broke apart only when the ferry gave a particularly violent lurch, followed by the sudden hum of machinery coming back to life. The main lights flickered on, replacing the emergency blue with warm yellow illumination, and the PA system crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've restored main power and are continuing our journey to the island. The worst of the storm has passed, though we still expect rough seas for the remainder of the crossing. We anticipate docking in approximately 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience and understanding during this unexpected event. Jamie and I looked at each other in the harsh clarity of the regular lighting, both slightly disheveled, lips reddened from our kiss. For a moment, I feared the spell might be broken, that what had felt magical in the storm-tossed darkness might seem foolish in the light. But Jamie smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had first drawn me to him, and any concerns I had vanished. Well, he said, it seems we've weathered the goddess's test together. Does that mean I've earned her good fortune? I asked, reluctantly disentangling myself from his embrace, as we both acknowledged that we would soon need to rejoin the other passengers. I'd say we both have, Jamie replied, standing and offering me his hand. What are your plans on the island? I have a room booked at the Harbor View Inn for 2 nights, I said. taking his hand and allowing him to pull me to my feet. Beyond that, my schedule is completely open. In that case, Jamie said, his fingers intertwining with mine, would you allow me to show you my island? The real island, not just the tourist spots. The hidden coves, the artist colonies, the cliffs where I painted that sunset you loved so much. I'd like that, I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the ferry's restored heating system. I'd like that very much. We gathered our belongings and made our way back up to the main deck, still hand in hand. The other passengers looked relieved as normalcy returned, the earlier panic replaced by excited chatter about the adventure they'd have to tell friends about back home. No one paid much attention to us, two young men with slightly rumpled clothes and barely suppressed smiles. As we emerged onto the outer deck, the storm was indeed subsiding. Rain still fell, but more gently now, and breaks in the clouds allowed occasional shafts of late afternoon sunlight to pierce through, creating dazzling patterns on the churning sea. Ahead, the island was coming into view, its green hills and clustered buildings a welcome sight after our turbulent journey. Look, Jamie said, pointing to where the sun was breaking through more persistently. A rainbow. Sure enough, arcing across the sky between the ferry and the island was a perfect rainbow, its colors vivid against the dark backdrop of retreating storm clouds. Another sign from the sea goddess? I asked, leaning slightly against his shoulder. Definitely. Jamie nodded solemnly, though his eyes twinkled with humor. She approves of us. As the ferry approached the island dock, passengers began gathering their belongings and moving toward the exits. Jamie turned to me, his expression suddenly serious again. Alex, I know this has all been unexpected. Intense, even. If you need space or time to process, I understand. No pressure. I considered his words, appreciating the respect and consideration behind them. But as I looked at him, this talented, kind, authentic man who had held me through the storm, both literal and emotional, I knew with surprising clarity what I wanted. The only space I need, I said, squeezing his hand, is the space you promised to show me on your island. And as for time, I'd like to spend as much of it with you as possible while I'm here. The smile that broke across Jamie's face was like the sun emerging fully from behind the clouds, radiant, warming, full of promise. Then let me welcome you properly to my island, Alex. I think this might be the beginning of something wonderful. As the ferry docked and we disembarked onto the rain-washed pier, I couldn't help but feel that the storm had been not an obstacle but a catalyst, the perfect beginning to whatever story Jamie and I were about to write together on this island that already felt somehow like home. Total _char_count, 18,712.